Salam sejahtera, Anda bersama saya Rizal Zulkafli dan ini Niaga AWANI. Kita mulakan dengan perkembangan pasaran saham Amerika dan juga serantau. Saham di pasaran Asia meningkat dalam dagangan Rabu dengan CNBC lapor pelabur memilih aset berisiko dan yakin pelan rangsangan Amerika akan diluluskan dalam masa terdekat. Terdahulu saham di Bursa Amerika catat peningkatan pada Selasa dengan NASDAQ naik sekitar 3.69% pada penutup. Dalam masa yang sama, hasil bond perbendaharaan Amerika menurun dan pelabur membeli saham teknologi yang sebelum ini juga menurun.
Antara saham yang catatkan peningkatan pada dagangan Selasa termasuk Tesla, Amazon dan Microsoft. Pada penutup, indeks Dow Jones naik 30 mata, NASDAQ naik 464 mata dan S&P 500 naik 54 mata. Sebelum ini, saham syarikat teknologi ini catat kejatuhan selepas kerisauan berkenaan peningkatan hasil bond perbendaharaan Amerika dan penilaian yang dilapor terlalu tinggi. Dalam simakan akhir, hasil bond 10 tahun Amerika menurun kepada sekitar 1.523%. Ia sebelum ini meningkat dengan pelabur ambil kira pemulihan ekonomi Amerika yang lebih pantas, inflasi yang dijangka semakin tinggi berbanding awal tahun ini. Penganalisis yang dipetik Reuters menambah, saham berkaitan produk dan perkhidmatan yang akan dapat permintaan dengan pemulihan ekonomi dijangka meningkat.
I think it all started yesterday. We had a very key technical move. The NASDAQ fell into correction territory. It dropped over 10%. And when we take a look at some of the most loved COVID trades, we saw Apple down over 20%. Tesla stock was down around 40%. And that really triggered, I think, a lot of institutional interest. We also had was the market's been really following the move in treasuries. And I think the bond market sell-off was a little bit overdone. We had a positive auction today, and I think there's an optimism that eventually this move in skyrocketing treasury yields is going to start to slow down. The Fed is most likely to act if there is some market disruption. So investors just saw that this is a perfect opportunity to start to pile back into tech stocks. Now that the Biden administration is about to get 1.9 trillion finalized, that is really going to keep this economy going. There's some infrastructure in there, and I think what you're going to see Wall Street is focused on is now Biden is going to try to deliver infrastructure spending. And I think you can make a strong argument that if he's able to get some Republicans on board, you might have a surprise of infrastructure spending in the next few months.
Dan ikuti temu bual yang saya rakamkan bersama pengarah strategi pelaburan Naga Group Jamil Ahmad sebelum pasaran Amerika dibuka pada Selasa.
Jamil, thank you for joining us. Jamil, NASDAQ is down by 10% from its highest in February. Reuters reports that investors look at this as a sign that the market is in a correction. Tell us more about this and what is happening to tech stocks.
Thank you so much for having me once again. On headline, we are in a correction because a 10% decline from its peak of an asset means that we've now entered a correction territory. So that's correct, but we have to look at what's happened. If you look at the past 1 year performance, the NASDAQ moved roughly 105% from its lows at the time of the pandemic chaos, which was roughly March, April 2020. It's amazing that was 1 year ago. But back to the question. So we had that huge shoot up. Now that we have more optimism, fingers crossed, that vaccines will work, vaccines are getting distributed, and that in the second half of 2021, economies will be able to reopen. We now have a lot of rotations taking place. And I believe that what we're having right now in the NASDAQ is another rotation stock market, kind of a correction. It doesn't mean it's the end of its peak, but we're having a short-term correction based on that and the optimism that economies are getting back to normal. And also, if you look at the most recent developments with the US presidential stimulus package, the 1.9 trillion that's pretty much now approved, it's just a matter of finding the last details, that should promote economic growth as well. So we basically are seeing investors move into different assets. And I'm not that concerned about corrections because we look at markets that are very unjustifiable. We've spoken about this a lot. Planet markets are saying that everything is perfect. Planet reality, a pandemic and so on, is showing a complete different story.
Tell us more about these other assets that investors are moving into, and also a bit more about cyclical stocks, perhaps. Cyclical stocks have been mentioned a few times and are gaining a bit more attention now. Which sectors in the cyclical segment of that equity?
Rotations are happening fast, and because we had such a sharp, dramatic event over the past 1 year and still ongoing, I believe that more rotations will take place, and that rotations are not finished either. But what we can say, the sectors that have struggled the most from lockdowns, hospitality, including retail, food, travel, airlines, and so on, those are the kind of stocks that investors are looking for now, specifically when it comes to travel stocks and the airline sector. Those look quite appealing for bargain hunters. I'm not saying that retail can also be a cyclical stock, but this whole we're going to order and collect, or we're going to get it delivered, that's quite a trend that maybe, you know, people will not physically go into stores as much anymore. Maybe that's completely wrong. And then we look at other sectors like construction stocks, building stocks, and so on. I do think that, yes, they can improve, but generally, just because more construction activity is taking place because people are expanded and so on, and businesses, it does not necessarily mean that that stock's going to take place. So I believe that maybe the airline sectors will do better, and the travel sectors, than some of these other cyclical assets.
And bond yield continues to rise on Monday. Tell us more about the sell-off. Goldman Sachs believes that the stronger economic data should push the benchmark 10-year U.S. Treasury yield up to 1.9% by the end of 2021. Why would this? What would this mean for high-growth companies?
So essentially, again, we see very unjustifiable reward markets. And this kind of headline, I would say, is the rally and the speed on what the yield has moved that's causing the concern in the market. And I think we're now shaking up trees to some extent just to see where the apples drop and if something falls. The yield curve is going up on the expectations that interest rates are going up because inflation will rise. The reality is, yes, inflation is going to rise, but we've had this difficult and very strange, unusual period where we've had no inflation because the economy is on lockdowns. Because of this, from a central bank perspective, the Fed, the ECB, and central bankers worldwide are going to think, okay, this is actually just depressed demand that's coming back into the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it will be a concern on headline, but they will let that move. So I believe that at some point the Treasury yield will return back below, and until we get more clarity that central banks really will raise interest rates. And if you look at the statements from the Fed Chair Jerome Powell last week, who's the head of US Central Bank, that isn't happening anytime soon. I would say that this move will probably retrace at some point.
But how will the current situation, perhaps the stronger yield right now, affect the dollar and also ringgit?
This is a great question. So what we can see, the yield curve moving higher has impacted markets. We've had quite a few sell-offs on the global stock markets, including the NASDAQ, which is now down 10% correction territory. On the currency market and the other assets, what we see is a very much a lower gold price. That's been a strange surprise to many. I also thought that gold would do better in this environment. But because the yield curve's going up, gold prices are falling because investors are believing that central banks will move to the yield curve. They're not going to do it, but anyway, that's what they believe. And the dollar's having some of its best performances in months. If I give you the example of the euro dollar the past 3 days, which is the euro USD, that suffered its steepest 3-day drop since roughly April 2020. So I think that investors are seen as an opportunity to get longer and more positive on the greenback, which is the US dollar. So the dollar is strengthening across the board. If I give you the example of the Malaysian ringgit, we were speaking for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it was basically a snooze fest. The ringgit was not moving. But because the dollar has strengthened now quite aggressively, we've all of a sudden had a USD Malaysian ringgit that's moved from 405 to as high as 411. And that's the same across the world currencies. The pound has moved from something like 1.42, 1.43 to as low as 1.38. So we're seeing sharp appreciation across the currency markets for the greenback overall.
Mm-hmm. But will oil price be also supporting ringgit, maybe briefly?
On an economic level and on a governmental level, if you look at revenues, yes. But if you look at the currency wider dynamics, not so much. It can help. It can be a supporting factor. But Malaysian economy is not as sensitive to oil prices as, say, Nigeria, the Nigerian naira. If we look at the GCC economy and major oil producers, Malaysia's not at that level. I'm not going to say it's insignificant, but it's not as sensitive to an oil price move to some of our other currencies in the world.
On that note, we thank you very much, Jamil, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you and take care.
Dan Dewan Perwakilan Amerika dijangka luluskan pelan rangsangan $1.9 trilion pada hari ini. Sebelum ini, Senat lakukan perubahan sedikit kepada pelan berkenaan dan ia kini kembali ke Dewan Perwakilan selepas diundi di Senat. Pelan ini bagaimanapun saksikan penolakan keras daripada Republikan di kedua-dua dewan kerana menyifatkannya sebagai terlalu besar. Tambah mereka ada peruntukan yang tiada kaitan dengan situasi ekonomi semasa akibat pandemik COVID-19. Ini ketika hutang Amerika terus meningkat kepada $22 trilion. Antara peruntukan dalam pelan ini adalah pindahan tunai $1,400 kepada kebanyakan individu di Amerika, tambahan bantuan pengangguran, bantuan untuk vaksin COVID-19 dan kepada sekolah dan syarikat penerbangan. Ini penting untuk ekonomi terbesar dunia itu untuk tingkatkan perbelanjaan pengguna yang sumbang 2/3 kepada ekonominya. Dan 30% warga Amerika lapor pendapatan isi rumah mereka lebih rendah daripada sebelum pandemik COVID-19 dalam tinjauan The Associated Press Knox Center for Public Affairs Research. 53% laporkan tiada perubahan. Tinjauan berkenaan turut dapati krisis ekonomi akibat COVID-19 berikan kesan lebih besar kepada isi rumah kulit hitam, Latino dan juga belia. Tinjauan turut dapati separuh daripada responden ada kehilangan sekurang-kurangnya satu pendapatan dan 25% isi rumah hilang semua pendapatan. Responden turut lapor yang mereka ubah gaya hidup termasuk kurang makan di luar, mengembara dan berhibur. Sehingga kini Amerika adalah negara paling teruk hadapi penularan COVID-19 dan catat jumlah kematian tertinggi. Ini akibatkan pelbagai sekatan aktiviti ekonomi separa dan penuh yang seterusnya berikan kesan kepada perniagaan kecil dan pekerjaan. Kadar pengangguran di Amerika dilapor menurun sedikit kepada 6.2% pada Februari, namun sekitar 10 juta orang masih menganggur. Negara di serata dunia perlu percepatkan pelaksanaan program imunisasi untuk keluar daripada krisis ekonomi ketika ini. Menurut Organisasi Kerjasama dan Pembangunan Ekonomi OECD, ini termasuk menerusi lebih banyak pelesenan dan pemindahan teknologi berkenaan vaksin COVID-19.
OECD mengunjurkan ekonomi dunia akan tumbuh pada kadar 5.5% tahun ini dan 3.7% pada 2022. Ia turut menjangka pengeluaran ekonomi global akan melebihi tahap pra-pandemik COVID-19 pada pertengahan tahun ini.
Countries need to accelerate their vaccination program to reopen faster their economies. That means more licensing. It means more transfer of technology. It means vaccination centers working 7 days a week. More money is also needed for the rollout of vaccines to lower income countries.
Tegasnya, jika vaksin lambat diberikan, maka sektor seperti pelancongan dan pengembaraan yang penting untuk pekerjaan tidak akan dapat dibuka dengan baik. Namun, memberi amaran akan ada negara yang masih ketinggalan dari segi pertumbuhan sehingga akhir 2022. Ini berbanding negara seperti Amerika dan China yang dijangka tumbuh dengan pantas. Sementara itu, OECD jangka ada tekanan inflasi di Amerika, namun ia tidak membimbangkan. OECD turut beri amaran yang pasaran kewangan mungkin menyaksikan aliran keluar dana daripada pasaran ekonomi membangun kepada negara dengan pertumbuhan lebih tinggi. Ini menurutnya perlukan sokongan daripada Bank Pusat untuk kurangkan ketidaktentuan seperti yang berlaku pada Mac 2020. Ketika ini, negara ahli OECD saksikan tambahan penganggur sebanyak 10 juta orang berbanding tempoh sebelum krisis. Bagi negara berpendapatan rendah, jumlah pengangguran yang meningkat telah lonjakkan angka kemiskinan.
Dan kita akan berehat seketika, kembali selepas ini.